Bone marrow transplants have been the last best hope for thousands of people with cancer. Now, for the first time, the transplants are being used to treat other diseases, including a devastating and potentially deadly disease that affects tens of thousands of Americans. It is, by all accounts, a risky experiment. But for the young woman you'll meet tonight, it's a risk worth taking. Here's Margaret Larson.
It was a day Kirstin Wallin had always dreamed of. In a small chapel a couple hours north of Seattle, she married the man she called the love of her life.
Honor and keep her in sickness and in health.
At age 20, happy and seemingly so healthy, Kirstin had no way of knowing she was beginning a journey that would test her marriage and even her own will to live. Kirstin's childhood had been about as normal as anyone could imagine. She had a twin sister, Kelda, a fact doctors would make careful note of later as her puzzling medical case unfolded. The first sign of trouble came in her teens. A minor annoyance, she thought at the time. Her hands and feet always felt cold. Kirstin's mom, Debbie, says the doctor diagnosed the problem as Raynaud's phenomenon, essentially bad circulation.
He said this is a relatively common thing and not serious. And
don't worry about it too much.
Yeah, put her on some medication, and that seemed to take care of it.
But soon after the wedding, Kirstin's symptoms began to get worse. Still, her father, Bob, didn't worry.
She was always one that kind of made a little bit more out of things than they actually were. And so we didn't pay a lot of attention to it.
Kirstin decided to see a specialist. On a hunch, he did a blood test for something far more serious than bad circulation, an autoimmune disease called Scleroderma. The test was supposed to be just a precaution, but it confirmed the worst.
He did a test and it came up positive.
Had you ever even heard of Scleroderma before then?
No.
So this was a diagnosis out of the blue?
Yeah. Yeah.
And a scary one?
Well, yes.
What everyone had thought was a simple problem was now a potentially deadly disease. Dr. Daniel First, a rheumatologist at Virginia Mason Research Center in Seattle, knows how frightening the diagnosis is for patients.
There was a very well-known physician who said, no drug is truly worthless until it's been tried in scleroderma, because every drug has been tried and really very few have worked.
Scleroderma, literally hard skin, is the result of an immune system gone haywire. Cells deep in the immune system launch an attack on the body. It starts in the hands and feet. That's what had made Kirstin's hands and feet so cold. About half the time, the attack moves on to the face and torso. And unseen to patients, damage to the kidneys, heart, and lungs can eventually cause death. The disease affects at least 300,000 Americans, killing 10,000 a year. One theory says Kirstin's immune system was damaged when her twin sister's cells mixed with hers in the womb. But that idea is unproven. Scleroderma is still largely a mystery.
This disease is pretty devastating.
It's an extraordinarily devastating disease to the people themselves. In the most severe form of the disease, about 50% of people will die in 5 years.
As it turned out, Kirstin had the most severe form. When we first spoke with her last March, just a year and a half after the diagnosis, a face that had been the picture of health was showing clear signs the doctor's diagnosis was correct.
He told me, because he did tell me that I could possibly die from it. But I was more actually afraid from things that I read about it later, because everything that you read about it is scary.
You probably won't need to take it off.
Within a year, the disease had so stiffened Kirstin's hands she could no longer tie her own shoes. Her mouth and throat were so scarred she could barely eat. The toll on her body was sabotaging her self-esteem and her new marriage.
When my hands started curling over, that upset me a little, thinking I'm not sexy, you know, how can I be pretty when I look like this?
Within months, the marriage collapsed.
Eric, you or somebody want to come?
So Kirstin went home to her family. Her parents, her brother, and sister helped care for her, even cutting her meat into small pieces so her scarred digestive system could handle it. But the downward spiral continued.
We watched her deteriorate in front of our eyes.
You must have been terrified.
We were.
I know I was going to lose. I was going to lose my little girl.
With no effective treatment, the family tried to accept the inevitable, treasuring the days they had left together. Then the unimaginable. They got word of an unusual medical study just getting underway, one that provided a glimmer of hope. It was a totally new idea, hatched not in a lab, but over a cup of coffee in Seattle. Dr. First was taking a coffee break here with a colleague from another hospital just a few blocks away. She had seen some of cancer's best experts deal with a disease similar to scleroderma in bone marrow transplant patients. Suddenly, the two doctors saw a connection.
We kind of looked at each other and said, autoimmunity, bone marrow transplant. Let's find out if we can do it.
And an idea was born.
Simple as that.
So these are the latest.
So they turned to one of the country's best-known and most experienced bone marrow transplant specialists. Dr. Peter McSweeney from neighboring Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center had done hundreds of transplants in cancer patients, but scleroderma was entirely new.
They came in with certain organ damages that we don't usually like to take into a transplant setting, and that certainly made us nervous.
Bone marrow from a donor was considered too dangerous. Instead, doctors would use Kirstin's own cells. Still, it would be a risky experiment. A treatment that kills 2% of cancer patients could be even more deadly for people with scleroderma. Kirstin would be one of the first in the world to try it, and no one knew if it would work.
Why would this be a good idea for someone like Kirstin?
Because her prognosis is really pretty poor.
I'm like, let's do it, you know, even if it's just a slight chance. I don't want to sit around and wait for scleroderma to kill me.
And there she is.
Kirstin and the two hospitals decided to allow Dateline to record something rarely seen, the earliest attempts at a new high-stakes treatment, an experiment that would test the very limits of medical ethics.
Is it fair to ask these people to be human guinea pigs in a treatment so risky, so experimental?
They've got a bad disease, they're fully informed, they truly, I hope, understand the risks. And under those circumstances, they become part of the team.
It was a risk that brought Kirstin back to a faith she'd left behind as a teenager.
Father, in the name of Jesus, we thank you.
I'm trying not to hope for a miracle. I know that God's there, and that helps me a lot.
There was solace in prayer and support from family and friends. But her entire future depended on an untested treatment that could end her life instead of saving it. Could she take that risk? And would it work?
Some answers when we return.